started. So Avery has pushed play on the recording, so this is a public meeting. Just so you're all aware, what that means is that the chat has been disabled for this meeting, and the reason why is because we would then have to essentially read out every chat into public record, and so we've just disabled it. So if you have a question or if you have something to say, just simply interrupt me or raise your hand. The point of this meeting is to have discussion and to come to an agreement of what the big meeting, the big GRC meeting on the 31st is going to look like. So there will be, because it is a public meeting, at the very end, there will be time for public comment. And so if you are in this meeting and you're not a member of the Grant Review Committee, you will have a chance to speak at that time. So we have a few new members of the Grant Review Committee. So I just thought maybe we would start with some introductions. So I will start, and then I'll just ask my colleague Will to introduce himself, and then we'll go with OJD staff as well, and then maybe Grant Review Committee members. At that point, you can introduce yourselves. So I'm Rachel. I'm a policy analyst here at the CJC, and I've worked with specialty courts. This is my second grant cycle, so 2.5 years. So, well.
Hi, everyone. My name is William Ash Halchin. You can call me Will, and I'm a research analyst here at the Criminal Justice Commission. I've been with the commission since September of last year, so this is my first grant cycle with specialty courts. I'm thrilled to be here. So I will pass it to Danielle.
Good morning. My name is Danielle Hansen. I work for OJD in our Office of the State Court Administrator, supporting our specialty courts. And prior to that, I was a local coordinator. I've been working with specialty courts for 10 years. Rachel Mark.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Rachel Mark, and I'm a specialty court analyst at OJD. And like Danielle, I was previously a specialty court coordinator in Washington County, coordinating their local juvenile drug treatment court. And I've worked with them for about 16 years. And this is, I want to say, my third or fourth time being involved in the Grant Review Committee. So I'm happy to be back. Thanks for having me. And should I pass it over to Joe Garcia?
This is Joe Garcia. I'm the director for Douglas County Community Corrections. We operate under the Oregon Department of Corrections. I've been on this Grant Review Committee. I have no idea how long, probably since it started and before that. So anyway, glad to be a part of it again and help in any way I can. So I'll kick it over to Jake Greer.
I'm Jake Greer. I'm the director of Lake County Adult and Juvenile Probation. I've been a member of the committee, I don't know, 3 or 4 cycles. Thank you. I'll pass it over to, I don't see a list of names, so let me get there.
How about Julie? Julie can go next. I got you, Jake.
Pass it on to Julie then.
Hi all, I'm Julie Hewer. I'm the treatment court coordinator for Columbia County, and I have been the treatment court coordinator here since 2017. And I help coordinate adult drug court, family treatment court, veterans treatment court, and behavioral health court, which is our mental health court. And Rachel, I'm not sure who to pass it on to.
That's okay. Kelsey, you want to go?
Sure. I'm Kelsey McDaniel. I'm the elected district attorney in Union County. I've been a prosecutor for going on 15 years now, and I actually sit on our treatment courts here in Union County, which we have a drug treatment court and a behavioral health court that is a hybrid with a veterans court. And this is my first year participating on behalf of the Oregon District Attorneys Association, so I'm the newbie.
Okay, awesome. Like I said, we are expecting one more member, and then I did hear from a member this morning that is not able to make it due to a family emergency. So we'll see if RJ comes, we'll have him introduce himself as well. So we do have new members. What we tried to do this time was kind of balance out the Grant Review Committee with some different perspectives. And so we do have people with experience in mental health court, veterans courts, things like that, to just kind of make sure that it's not just coming from a drug court perspective, which is the most common type of specialty court. So we tried to balance the perspective of the Grant Review Committee a little bit, so we can have some informed decisions. So just really fast, I just want to explain the OJD role, the role of Danielle and Rachel on this committee. Last time they were active members of the Grant Review Committee and part of the discussion and the recommendations. And this year they've kind of shifted to staff, very much like CJC staff. And so they have been instrumental in this process, very much involved from the very beginning up until now, and will be involved all the way until the commission meeting. So I've asked them to just kind of be here to provide context, or if there's a question that is outside of my purview, to ask them to step in and answer any sort of questions. They'll have a little bit of a bigger role on the 31st, but for today, just anything that I am unable to answer that's not in my lane or my expertise, I've asked Rachel and Danielle to both be here for that. So they will not be part of any of the voting or recommendations or anything like that. So I just wanted to clarify that. We're happy they're here, mostly because they can answer questions that I'm unable to. So, okay, so let's get started. So the point of this entire meeting is to set up the meeting on the 31st of May, the big all-day meeting, so that we have an idea of what we're going to do during that meeting. It's a very long day. If you've all been involved in that, we have to go through a lot of applications. There's a lot of discussion and recommendations that are needed to come out of that meeting. And so we want to set it up today so that we're all on the same page and we have a very specific direction that we want to go in that will make that day a lot smoother. This is also an effort on our part to be as transparent as possible with our process. And so this is a public meeting. People can access this. Nobody will be surprised by hopefully, by anything that goes on the 31st. And so that's why we're here today. So because some of you are new, I'm gonna I'll share the agenda. This is a loose agenda, okay? So if I don't hit the times, please don't hold it against me. But I'm gonna set this up by going through and providing an update on the grant administration in general for CJC. We've made a lot of changes. Some of you have heard this already, but I want to make sure that we all are on the same page. So go through some changes that we've made in general at CJC, and then specifically the specialty court program. The process this time is very, very different than what it has been in the past. And I know that we have had some instability and unpredictability in that process. And so I want to make sure that everybody understands what we're doing for this grant cycle. And then we'll get into your roles, your expectations for the 31st, and then beyond that as well. I'm going to also ask some questions of you and ask that you come to some consensus today on the analysis part. So that's kind of setting up those guardrails going into the 31st is where we're going to ask for discussion from you all. And then, like I said, there will be, we will have a slide on conflict of interest because I know that there have been some questions about that, and then we'll have public comment and then any other questions or anything else that y'all want to cover. So that is the agenda for today. So let's start off with CJC as a whole. We recognized at the beginning, I guess, last summer, that there was a need to standardize processes across all of our grant programs. So what we recognized was people who were doing impacts grants, specialty court grants, JRI grants, all from the same county, the same applicant, were experiencing a different process, different expectations, different applications, all of those. And so we recognized that there was a need to standardize those processes. And so there's some predictability to it, there's some transparency to it, and everybody understands and kind of recognizes what CJC, what their grant programs look like. And so we went out, we asked for feedback from community partners, from grantees, and wanted to get their insight on how to improve the integrity of our grant programs and make sure that they were consistent and transparent. So made a few changes. Probably the biggest change is we came up with a grant administration guide. We used to have a grant management handbook that was, I don't know, 40 pages long. It was pretty confusing, had a lot of information that hadn't been updated in a while. And so we took that and developed a grant administration guide that rather than updating it every biennium, we were going to update it yearly. And so we have a 2023 grant administration guide that goes over general policies and procedures that are in place for every grant program that we have. And so there's one place to get those that are applicable to all the grant programs. And then we go through very specific grant programs with eligibility requirements, things that are a little bit specific to those programs. And then also at the back, we have state and federal guidelines, particularly federal regulations for those courts, especially courts that do receive federal money. That is a place to go for guidance on that. One thing that was updated that is always a question is the list of unallowables. That has changed slightly. And so we tried to make that as consistent as possible across grant programs. And again, if something changes conversation-wise or something changes as we come out of session, we can update this document yearly or as we need to. And it's less of a lift and a little bit more predictable. We also had these RFGPs that were very cumbersome. Across grant programs, they were all very different. And so we've pared that down into a solicitation, and it's a 1 to 2 page, maybe 3-page document for every grant program that just describes grant specific details. And so it's eligible applicants, duration of funding, availability of funding, application requirements, and then the grant cycle timeline. And so very simple information. This comes out when the application itself is released. And so again, it's an effort to streamline our processes and make them a little bit more predictable. The information across the board on these grant programs is different, but the document is the same. And so it looks very similar. So again, we're trying to make it so that there is some predictability across all of the grant programs. So, so that is an update on overall the different changes that we've made in our grant programs. So wanted to touch, are there any questions on that? Those documents are available on our website. Does anybody have any specific questions on those changes? Okay. Okay, so why we're here. So the specialty court grant cycle for this upcoming biennium. We went out and we got some feedback from grantees from the last biennium, community partners, and there was a very strong emphasis put on the need for consistency within this program. There's been some inconsistent expectations, applications, grant cycles, all of that. There's also been a lot of turnover in this particular seat where I am. And so we've recognized this need for consistency, transparency, but also efficiency within this program. And so kind of started at the beginning and have tried to build this program to achieve that. And so our focus this grant cycle is to establish a baseline. We want to have a foundation and a baseline that is very clear, very concise, and moving forward, we'll continue to build on that foundation. And so we've really tried, we understand kind of this, that there has been a lot of change within this grant program. And so we're trying to be very aware of that with our expectations of grantees this cycle. And so we've been messaging out that we're building a foundation, that we're going to try to establish this baseline with the idea that we're going to continue to build on it. And so the next cycle, might have some different expectations or outcomes, but this foundation will be the same. It will be a process that's recognizable by the grantees. That's our goal. Okay, so we took this process and we broke it up into two different parts. So there is a preliminary application and there's a final application. So those of you that are involved in the JRI grant, this is very similar. So this is a very similar process to JRI. Hi, RJ. The May 31st meeting, the big grant review committee, is just to look at the preliminary application. So the big difference, and I'll get into kind of what's in that, but the big difference is we're going to be reviewing applications where there's not a budget attached. Okay, which is it's a big change from what's been done in the past for specialty courts. And so we'll kind of get into that process and then what your all's role will be on that day. Any questions on this? We're going to get into a little bit more detail, but I just want to see if there's any questions so far. Okay. So this is the timeline. There's a lot of text on this slide, and I apologize. I tried to fit everything in just so you all know where we're at. We're obviously at the May 10th meeting. So there's a lot of dates after that. So we've done a lot of work so far. CJC staff, OJD staff have done a lot of work so far, but the big lift is going to be these review meetings, as well as looking at budgets, and then the commission meeting that's coming up, so in July. So we still have a lot of work to do. There's still a lot of things, moving parts and things like that, but I wanted to give you all an idea of where we are in the timeline. So like I said, a lot of text, but we are moving forward. So eligible applicants for the specialty court, they have to have existing Oregon Circuit Court specialty courts. So they have to be a circuit court. We have had applicants that have asked in the past that weren't circuit courts, and so they're not eligible. They have to have access, and they must use the specialty court management system, SCMS. This is particularly important as we move forward with our analysis. And so we are really pushing them to not only have access to it, but also to use it. And then they must have a treatment provider that accepts the Oregon Health Plan. So one of the changes that we made was, in the past, we've had a project period that has just gone from July 1st in the beginning of the biennium all the way to June 30th. And so there's been a very hard cutoff. So the current grant cycle that we're going through, 21-23, has a very hard cutoff of June 30th. And so what we've recognized is that sometimes courts have difficulties spending down funds during that time. And so we've actually extended the project period to December 31st, 2025. So there's not going to be that hard cutoff at the end of the biennium. What that means is there's going to be some overlap. So as this one is closing 6 months later, there will be an opening of the 25-27 grant cycle at the same time. And so there's going to be 6 months of overlap, which hopefully will alleviate that mad rush at the end of a biennium to spend funds down. So there will be some overlap with that. For the financial reporting, this was a big change as well for specialty courts. We do currently do reimbursements, so RFRs, where they turn in reimbursements at the end of each quarter. We are going to change that into advance payments. And so instead of asking for money after the fact, they're just going to get money into an account. There's a period, I think it's every 6 months, they'll get a payment of their award into an account. And so the funds are available and they're there. This is what happens with every other one of our grant programs at CJC. And so we've made this change to be a little bit more consistent, but also allow for a little bit of autonomy with the courts in terms of spending. And then also the contract process has been very cumbersome for this program. And so we're going to be changing that as well. So here are some of the requirements that the grantees were supposed to have. There was a primary application. They've already turned this in. So they had a narrative portion. They did have required documentation, which I'll go over. And then we pulled data from SCMS, as well as the courts were asked to fill out a specialty court operating profile, which we call the SCOP. And we got that data as well. So we have all of this currently. And then the final application is going to be an opportunity to respond to feedback from you all. And it's also going to be when they turn in their budget projection sheets, which we will also get to. So we recognize that there is a need. We want to be data driven, right? We want it to be evidence-based driven, but we also recognize there's a need for a qualitative analysis. And so we did provide a narrative portion of the application where overall there's a focus on the adherence to the Oregon Specialty Court standards. And so we tried to design questions where grantees would be given the opportunity to highlight what they do well as talk about some of the challenges in implementation or some of the challenges of why they're not meeting particular standards. And so we also wanted them to give us the opportunity to talk about sustainability. And so talk about other funding sources, what they use CJC funds for, and so we can get an idea of where those potential gaps and resources are. And so we tried to make this a much more efficient narrative portion, and so we did do word limits. We cut down the number of questions. I think there were 14 total, and so made it more efficient, made it a little bit more streamlined, but also this time had a very clear focus on how courts meet standards or not. And so the goal was to adherence to standards is kind of that foundation that we're looking at. We did ask for documentation. We used to ask grantees to talk about these things, and we realized that's a huge lift for them. And so in an effort to kind of lessen that lift, we just asked that they turn these in. And so the first two, the letter of supports, were required. And then the rest of them were, particularly like the CCO notice of coverage, were things that if they could turn in. They will be given the opportunity in the final application to turn in any documents that they may not have had time or revising or needed signatures for during the preliminary application. So this gives us an indication that they have these things and that they're using them within the operations of their specialty courts. But we kind of cut out that requirement that they explain all of these things. And then the quantitative analysis, this is a new portion of the specialty court analysis, and this is what we are going to rely on more heavily moving forward. And so when I talk about establishing a foundation or a baseline, we want these outcomes and these analyses to be data driven, best practices and things that we can continue to look at and continue to find ways to improve with the context of a narrative, right? So we're not going to ignore context or caveats or, explanations of things that, this is why they are the way they are for a particular court. So we want the narrative to play a piece. We understand the importance of a qualitative analysis, but we also understand that it's really important that we make this grant program rely more heavily on data and evidence-based practices. So we pulled data from SCMS, and then we also quantified and scored outcomes from the SCOP and from SCMS. And again, it's to establish a baseline so that we can continue to grow this particular program. And then the budget projection sheet is also different. It used to be part of the application. We've actually, like I said, pulled it. And so this will be the second part. This will be the final application. It is standardized across grant programs. And so it looks a little different for specialty courts as it has in the past. I do have a webinar scheduled for grantees next Monday where we're going over this and what it's actually going to look like. It is going to be unique in the sense that so last cycle, we had counties were awarded money and then they allocated funds to OJD. That is also going to be the process in this upcoming grant cycle. And so there are two sheets. There's county allocated funds and then OJD funds that the county has allocated to them. And the reason why we do this is it's simply easier and faster for CJC to have one contract with OJD rather than OJD having to have 52 contracts with all of the different courts. And so the county is allocating money to OJD through CJC. And so still county money, it's still awarded to the county. There's just a different process in terms of contract. And so we're asking when they turn in their budget projection sheet that they differentiate between county allocated funds and then county allocated funds to OJD. Did that make sense? Does anybody need clarification on that process? Okay. And when we do the final application, when we actually review that, it will make a little bit more sense in terms of what that looks like. Okay. So this is why you're all here, besides hearing me talk for 30 minutes on things. Okay, so what we want to do today is just go over your particular role. And like I said, we want to have some discussion on some guardrails that we're going to set for the meeting on the 31st. So for staff, we review the applications for completeness. We've analyzed and scored each applicant's adherence to the Oregon Specialty Court standards. And then we've also identified from those scores, we've identified any needs or gaps in resources among each court. So we've looked at and scored each court based on what they've turned in, based on what they've given us, and then we have come up with a recommendation to you all in terms of where those gaps in resources are. So your all's role is to evaluate the adherence to specialty court standards. And so very similar to us and what we did when we did the score sheets, also focusing on an adherence to those standards is the baseline for this grant cycle. To discuss applications collaboratively, the meeting on the 30th, I know I'm talking a lot today, but this is actually your meeting, as is the 31st. It's for discussion and ultimately recommendations. So the outcome of the meeting on the 31st, because there isn't a budget attached, is that based on our CJC staff identification of needs and resources and those gaps, you're all going to provide recommendations for funding requests to grantees for the final application round. So this is a very different process than what has been done in the past. And we'll get into a little bit more detail in terms of what that looks like. But that's the ultimate outcome or goal for May 31st. And then you all will ultimately provide final funding recommendations to the commission. And then the commission will consider those recommendations and then ultimately make those funding decisions on those applications. So any questions on this slide? Okay, everybody's clear. Okay, so one of the things that we did this grant cycle was staff took on a bigger lift in terms of application analysis. And the reason why is because we recognize that there are a lot of applications. There's 52. That's a lot. And so trying to be efficient, trying to be transparent, we took a lot of the lift in terms of analyzing these applications on the front end and then providing you all with the information that you think you will need to ultimately give feedback to these applicants and then ultimately make funding recommendations to the commission. So in the past, we have grouped applications by county, and this time we are grouping them by court type. And so we have divided them by drug courts, mental health courts, and then because there's a lower number, we've kind of combined family treatment courts, veteran courts, and juvenile courts. And so those are the three different types that we're going to be looking at. We feel like this is a better way to get a good understanding of how courts are meeting standards, okay, by comparing them to similar court types. Also, DUI is in there as well, so they're in the smaller group. So we took all of the SCMS data, we took all of the data from the SCOP, and we developed a score sheet to give us a pretty good in-depth look at how each court is doing with regards to standards and where there is a potential opportunity for improvement. Okay, and then from this analysis, you all will then come in and provide guidance, funding request recommendations that will meet the needs, the needs of each court. Okay, so that's on the front end. Like I said, that's kind of the big difference is CJC staff has done quite a big lift. And so we can be as efficient as possible on the 31st. So I don't know if you can see this. Hopefully you can. It's a bit of a, and if you can't see it, I do have other examples. If you want to look at that, I can stop sharing this screen and pull up another one. So let me know if you want to see this a little better. But this is the score sheet that we developed, has all of the information from the SCOP, as well as the data that we pulled from SCMS. And then in deciding, so the red part on this is they didn't meet standard, either based on a score or a count. And what we did is we went through each of these categories, and with the notion that we want to build a baseline, we understand that the expectation that every court is meeting every standard is a little bit unfair from where we are, especially because this is a new process, all of those things. And so some of these, there is a column here where some of these were scored and some of them are recommendations. And so we recognized that if they didn't meet a recommendation that they should be meeting those standards, it's not a punitive, or it doesn't, we're not going to hold them against them for not meeting that standard, but they are going to see this. And so it is a recommendation moving forward that they can make changes to meet those particular standards. The ones that were scored are where you get the score of 41 out of 50. Okay. And so we tried to be intentional on what we chose to score and on what we chose to recommend. And so, like I said, it goes from standard 1 to 10, and we recognized based on the reds, the ones that they didn't meet, we tried to develop some recommendations of potential funding sources that they could access, or funding recommendations from the Grant Review Committee. Okay. The good news is every court is going to get this after this process is over. And so they're going to have a very transparent view of where and how they fell in relation to the standards. And so this is something throughout the rest of the biennium that they can look at, they can have, and they can understand going into the next cycle, some of the expectations that the Grant Review Committee may have for improvement. So any questions on this particular score sheet or this process? Okay. So here's the part where I need your all's participation and discussion. So how you all use this information to make funding recommendations, to make recommendations on funding requests is something that we would like to establish today. Okay, so we have two options to present to you all, as well as a staff recommendation on what you all are going to do with this information on the 31st. Okay. So option A, we can group each court type. So within each court type, we will group high, medium, or low scores. And basically, those with low will get the most analysis, the most discussion from you all. Those with medium scores will get some analysis, and those with high scores will get less. And so what that means for you all is a court who gets a high score could get a continuation of doing what you're doing with the expectation that their funding request keeps operations intact while also considering previous spending levels. And so it's keep doing what you're doing, but also just ask for what you need to keep specialty court operations going. Okay. And so what I need you all to tell me if you end up choosing this option is what kind of information you would need on a slide for all of these different kinds of scores. So for example, a medium score, we could have standards missed on the slide along with some contextual data from the narrative, as well as some of the SCMS data like completion rates for you all to get a better picture of how this court is actually operating and what resources they may need. So for a low score, we could give standards missed along with even recommendations that they missed, contextual data from the narrative. We could give all of the information pulled from SCMS, so that would be completion rates, participation rates, and capacity to give you a very clear picture of how that particular court is doing. And so the funding recommendation or the funding recommendation request would be more accurate for the courts that are struggling to meet standards. So one of the strengths of this particular option is that it provides individual feedback to these particular courts and considers differences between courts beyond court type. And so it considers like regional differences, geographical differences, resources, and those types of things. So that is a strength of this particular option. And we've also, like I said earlier, we have identified funding recommendations based off of each court score sheet that we could also provide to you all. So option B is a little different. We could bucket these by aggregate trends identified across score sheets. And so what that means is, for example, we could say among drug courts, we've identified that those courts with ratings below 40, more often than not, the court is not meeting enough. So the specialty court team is not meeting enough, and they're not tracking their data in SCMS. Okay, and so that can be an aggregate trend for that particular court type with a score below. And so we can recognize trends across the different scores and then provide that information to you. Okay, this is a bit of a step away from an individual analysis of each court. Okay, it would be more or less courts who fall under this particular score. This is what we think that they may need based on the trends of their score. Okay, so it doesn't recognize specific individual needs, but looks at overall identified needs of each court that scored at a certain level. Okay, and again, we can provide funding recommendation requests based on those aggregate trends. Okay. So CJC staff recommendation. Both approaches are valid. They prioritize funding recommendations to courts. They just do it in a different way. We recommend option A, just because it allows for very individual feedback to be provided for each court, with the idea that they continue to improve throughout the biennium and continue to build on that foundation that we're trying to establish. And so you'll also be able to provide very specific feedback and funding recommendations to target those courts' needs and what they need to do to adhere to standards moving forward. So this is our recommendation, but it's up to you all to decide what option you would like CJC staff to move forward with for analysis. So after I've been talking for the entirety of this meeting, I'm going to turn it back over to the Grant Review Committee to kind of discuss if anybody has, anything to say or any questions. Joe.
I would just say that I actually like option A, and I think providing feedback, for all the work that the local courts put in. Sometimes part of that frustration is they don't really understand not just the funding piece, but like why certain things were done or not done. And I think they've historically looked for feedback in some way. And so if that's how we build it moving forward and they know that up front, I think that helps the process and just the transparency of the process as well. So in terms of the funding piece of it, it always comes down to, it seems like for me, a few things. Are we supplanting money? Do we have concerns about that in programs? And then cost per participant overall. Some programs will cost more just by the nature of the type of service they're delivering. But others, historically, if you're a small county and you need a certain level of resource to operate a program versus, some people are anticipating cuts and reductions, in their departments, and suddenly they're wanting, to fund full-time FTE, to backfill. And so those things historically have always been drivers that, we end up discussing from a budget perspective that do weigh in. And one of the things that I think I brought up last time, and I'm still concerned about it this time, and it'd be helpful if the staff provided us an overview when we got into reviewing applications up front, is it still feels like there's a decline in a non-recovery of the number of participants we have in programs across the state. And I could be wrong, but when we think back to the heyday of how many people were operating in some of these programs to where we're at now, in some jurisdictions it's like an 80% reduction. And so how does that impact us kind of moving forward too? So that's just more of a comment and something I think would be helpful for us to look at as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate that. I think RJ was next. You're still muted, RJ. There you go.
There we go. I think I found it. So I am in favor of option A. I did have some questions about some of the slides from earlier. Are we gonna have time to circle back on those?
For sure. Yeah. Yeah. At the end, we can. Absolutely. Yeah.
Perfect.
So do you have any other comment on option A, or is that where you're for that?
Yeah, I support
Okay.
option A. I think that it's a great opportunity for us to really focus on the individual challenges that these courts are facing and give recommendations. And so I like it.
Thank you. Jake?
Yeah, I agree with RJ. It gives the individual courts a roadmap on things to address, things to work on, and also incentive to get from that low to the medium or high. But it puts a focus on the individual courts, whereas B kind of groups everybody together and says, yeah, this is a common theme. Well, common themes are great, but what do I need to focus on? And then just to circle back around to what Joe said, I agree with Joe on the budget stuff. We're in a budget crunch as far as our grant and aid dollars go for community corrections. So I see some courts or some departments asking for shooting from the hip and asking for the whole pot as opposed to not. So just setting all that groundwork and making sure we stick to that. But option A would be my recommendation.
All right, thank you, Jake. Julie?
Yeah, just as a current, coordinator, I also am in favor of option A. All the feedback we can get is really, really helpful. It's also helpful with our community partners when we are asking them to provide, information in SCMS or in other ways so that, hey, this really does affect our grant funding. We get feedback from the Criminal Justice Commission on these things. So it just helps our overall relationships and collaboration with our community partners. And I also think, like everyone else has said, it just gives us a chance to see how we can improve and work on those specific things.
Okay, thank you, Julie. So it sounds like option A is what everybody is leaning towards. So that is what CJC staff will move forward with unless anybody has any objection to that. Okay, so before we move on, because we are going to talk about budget and what that actually looks like, I just want to make sure from you all, I want to make sure that you all have the information that you need to make an informed recommendation for a budget request. And so is it okay for the ones that score high? Oh, Jake, go ahead. Sorry.
Just so I don't know if stigma is going to be an issue, but the low, medium, high, as opposed to meets, needs, or exceeds, and needs improvement, that kind of stuff instead of the low, medium, high.
Okay, yeah. So bucket it like. So the way that we were going to do this, we can think about kind of a different way to label. Because what we want to be able to do is the ones who score low versus medium versus high. There are even the ones that score high have missed standards, right? And so we want to be able to speak to that and to still provide feedback and recommendations. And so maybe not meet all of that, but we'll think of something a little bit, a better way, a softer way to bucket that. That's great feedback. But still be able to give those that do score higher some very specific feedback and maybe some funding recommendations as well. So that's great feedback on that. So what kind of information for somebody that scores high and gets less analysis and essentially is told, keep doing what you're doing, but maybe focus a little bit on this. What kind of information do you all need from me? And so the idea behind this is that we spend less time on those courts because they're doing well, right? And so we can provide specific feedback, but also we don't have to have an in-depth discussion. RJ.
Could you go back to the slide where it shows what you're already tracking?
This one?
Yeah. Yes, that one.
And if you need a bigger score sheet, please let me know. I can pull it up on a different screen if you'd like to look at that. And so in this one, right, we haven't bucketed them yet. So I don't know where a court that got a 41 would fall. But we can provide information about what standards were not met. We can provide context from a narrative. We can provide, the data, more information on the data. So we can pull this information and put it on a slide. And so that you all can see it and then make an informed recommendation. With the idea being that those that score on the lower end need a little bit more discussion to get a very specific feedback on what they need to do to improve, under the assumption that they have more improvements to make than somebody that scores high. Jake.
I see that these are all important things to have and pay attention to. But I think we can prioritize the top tier of these. And if courts are meeting those, then we can focus on some of the little things. So I think that'll help give some kind of a score breakdown of what's high, what's medium, and what's low as far as scoring goes. Hypothetically, if every court doesn't meet every single standard, focus on the standards, just kind of an outline of what standard wasn't met and why we feel it wasn't met. And then the lower priority points, just a blurb about how to address those. But I don't know how to group these into high, medium, low priorities. Because they all are
sorry,
priorities.
Just to clarify, we will be bucketing them. CJC staff will be bucketing them, right? And so that's not something that you all need to do today because you don't have all the information. So we will be bucketing them based on, we developed a median of where all of the court types fell on their score sheets. And so we will be bucketing them appropriately. What I need to know from you all is what information do you want on a slide when I present it to you to make an accurate. If you want the same information across for high, medium, and low, we can do that. And so it's up to you all in terms of what you think you need or you're going to need for these particular buckets to make an informed decision. There's no wrong answer. RJ.
Yeah, and I'm kind of new to this, so forgive me if I'm not hip to everything. But I think I'd like to see a sanction count on that, because to me, if folks are being sanctioned, then they're not receiving the support that they need to be successful in their program.
Okay, is this something you want to see on all of them, or is this something you want to see if they miss? If they don't meet it?
I'd want to see if they don't meet it.
Okay, perfect. Joe, I think you're next.
I think for me, what would be most helpful is, structurally, we obviously need to know where they're at in terms of meeting the standards. But usually what ends up driving whether or not someone's in the high category or low category is if there's missing key components that are directly impacting programs. So for example, you don't have a key member of the staff, a district attorney, a parole and probation officer, something like that, because it has impacts in a variety of different ways. And so, and then usually we have some kind of understanding, or someone does on the team, of what some of those issues are or challenges that they're facing. And so I think for us, for the staff to have that kind of prepped for us, and obviously OJD can help with that as well. So that we know if these courts are being funded, are they being funded in a way that's going to help support, move them in the direction to be successful and achieve, those outcomes and be consistent with, the rest of the programs? Or is this something that, maybe funding isn't going to help them actually achieve those goals, or it's not possible to? And so therefore we have to look at other options in that process, which means we're divvying up that money to other programs for, to cover costs that we may be, short on and something like that. So for me, that's kind of how, I view these as, when the staff can go through and match those key components, you'll know where people fall. This is your second go around. I've got confidence in you guys to obviously do it. You did a good job last time too. And the process we're using so far this time is much better and streamlined. And so just for me, I think that's what's going to help the most.
Okay. Thank you for that. Is everybody comfortable with CJC staff providing recommendations for a possible, we recommend to you a possible funding recommendation to the courts? And so we've identified gaps in resources, things like that. Is that helpful for us to have on the slide of potentially this is where funds could go? Is that something that would be helpful to you all to see across each court? I see a couple people nodding their heads, so I'm good. Okay, okay. Okay, so, all right, so, just before we move on, I just want to make sure, do you all want the same information on the slides despite how they're scored, so that you can make I know we'll include the key components, we'll include standards that they missed. We can include context from a narrative. I think that's what Joe was talking about specifically. Anything that, you know, CJC staff can recognize from the narrative that OJD can contribute as well. Before we move on, because we are going to talk about kind of the budget piece a little bit and what that means for funding recommendations, is there anything else specifically that you all want to see? There is a data piece, that on the score sheet are all recommendations. We can potentially pull those in as well. I think they're all, except for the completion rate is a score. We can pull those in as well for courts that score lower, if you'd also like to see that. So completion rates, participation rates, and then I'm missing one. What is it? Oh, capacity. Are those things that you would like to see on courts that are not scoring high?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All three of them? Okay. Okay. Okay, so we have option A. We're going with option A in terms of an analysis. We're going to bucket them. CJC staff will bucket them accordingly. Jake provided good feedback on how we label those, high, medium, and low. We'll try to figure out some language that's a little more helpful than that. Looking at missing key components, in particular, providing context from the narrative, and then pulling in those pieces that were pulled from SCMS for information for courts that didn't score as high. Anything else? Also, if you think of something, this is like, you can call me or email me or something like that, and we can have that discussion. But this is what we're going to be going with in terms of presenting information to you on the 31st. Okay. Okay, so one of the challenges with this is essentially what this means. And so I would like to now kind of discuss the utility of option A, and particularly what this feedback looks like to courts. Okay, so remember, this is not coming with a budget request. You all are going to be giving funding request recommendations to courts based on the resources that they're lacking, the gaps, the lack of adherence to standards, or vice versa. Okay, so this is, and then they're going to go do a budget. They're going to fill it out based on your feedback, your recommendations. We're going to meet again in July. We'll review those, and then you'll make final recommendations to go to the commission. Okay, so this is a different process. So what I would like to talk about is what that feedback specifically looks like that comes out of the 31st that's going to help these courts do their budgets, their budget requests. Okay, so the priorities are based on needs and improvement for adherence to standards. We've talked about that. And to fill a resource gap that is preventing courts from operationalizing the standards. Okay, that's kind of what we want to focus on, is the operational cost of specialty courts. So what do they need? What support do they need to operationalize the standards? Okay, so a couple things to consider. I'm just going to go through these and discuss them, and we'll kind of come to a consensus. So there's a limited budget. We know that. Okay. There's more applicants than there was last time. Last time there was 47. This time there's 40 or 52. And so what we're trying to do is, coming out of this meeting, is to be more intentional about how we use CJC funds to support the courts. Okay. We don't have enough funds to just fully support all of the courts. And so we're trying to get very specific, be intentional about the very specific feedback that we give them to provide guidance on how we can use these funds to support them. Okay, so this is a shift in mindset for the applicants. It used to be where they come to us with a budget, and then the grant review committee has to make some very deep cuts to meet a specific number. The goal this time is to provide them with feedback, and so we don't have to make those deep arbitrary cuts when we review budget requests, okay? This has been messaged to applicants as well, and we'll continue to do, particularly the webinar on Monday. And so this should not be a surprise to them that this is the new process. Okay, and so if you've been paying attention to what's come out of session, there is a recommendation, a governor's recommendation, that the general funds available for specialty courts be cut by 6%. Okay, and so we are expecting less general funds to be available for specialty courts. We don't have a number yet, but that is the expectations. Okay, and with that, we have done a projection for the courts that are currently in this current biennium using CJC funds. There's a projection that we will be about 23% underspent. Okay, so with those two things, a consideration may be capping a total ask based on spending trends of this biennium. Okay, let me provide an example and then you all can discuss. So if we have two courts, okay, that were each given $1 million last biennium, and as applicants, they come in and they both score very high. Okay, so they're doing well, right? So the feedback is going to be essentially keep doing what you're doing, right? But this court over here has spent $1 million on their operational costs, and this court over here has spent $500,000. Okay, they're both doing well. They're both scoring high, but the operational cost of this court is lower. And so the idea with less funds available, more applicants, okay, and current underspending is that we cap spending requests based on their current operational costs with a little, like, you know, caveat for inflation, those types of things. So it wouldn't be capped at 500,000, but it would be capped in a way to where we could say, here's your operational cost, keep doing what you're doing. So that's an example. It doesn't have to be that way, but that's kind of a way to look at what I mean by capping costs. Thoughts on that? And sorry, Jake, I know you're going to talk. The outcome for this is, if you want to make these decisions today, then you can. Okay, if this is something you all want to decide going into May 31st, that this is how it's going to be, that is the outcome that we can get. If this is something that you want to wait and consider on the 31st, then we can do that as well. I will say that the utility of doing it today means that we can go into the 31st on the same page, and these types of decisions have already been made. So there is an advantage of doing that today. So RJ, I think you were first.
It's my understanding that while the majority of these treatment courts are funded by general funds, the Veterans Treatments Courts is funded by Veteran Services Funds. So will we have two separate caps for the two different pots that are funding these courts?
Yes, that's a great question. So funding streams do matter, right? So there is a specific funding stream for veterans courts that the entirety of these funds will go towards veterans courts. And so what will happen is, based on the award, we will divide those funds up between those courts. And so there doesn't need to be a cap on that funding stream, if that makes sense, but there can be a cap on their total ask. Does that make sense? So we won't cap the funding stream for vet courts, but we might cap spending and then take those, just use that funding stream to give them funds.
Okay.
That sounded unclear in my head. Was that clear to you at all?
No, that makes sense to me.
Okay, cool. Okay, Kelsey.
So I had a question about the operational cost example that you gave. Is that amount that you're talking about, this the operational costs, are those stagnant numbers, or are those numbers that fluctuate depending on number of participants? Just because I think that is a concern in terms of capping a court if we have an increase in crime, or there's going to be a huge DOC release population, or an increase in, I guess, other variables that may not factor into that capped cost, and if that's part of the analysis with making that determination.
Yes, that's a great question. So yes, so we will consider, we can't, so the idea is that we can't predict what this is going to look like in 2 years, but we can use past spending as a guide to kind of be able to predict what their operational costs are. And so the idea is, going back to my example, the court that spent their $1 million should probably, they can use the $1 million. The court that spent 500,000, I don't know that it's beneficial for them to request $1 million again. So that's the idea, right? And so we can take, I don't know, 400,000 of that. We cap it at a certain level, take 400,000 of that and give it to other courts that may need that money. And so that's the overall idea. So yes, we'll take into account, inflation, different changes, personnel, all of those things. So it's not like a hard, this is your number, but it is looking at spending trends to come up with a cap on terms of what they can request. Did that answer your question? Kind of.
Yeah, I think so. I mean,
okay.
I think it really is going to depend from court to court on what that looks like. And I guess maybe the success in the articulation of what those needs are, or explanation for what the operational costs are.
Yeah, exactly. So we would look individually at every court's spending in this current biennium, and we would come up with a cap. And so if that was a cap you all agreed to in terms of giving that funding request, that actual recommendation and that feedback to that court, then that's what we would provide to them. So yes, so it would be very specific to every court and their spending, their current spending levels. Rachel.
Thanks. Just one clarification, Rachel. So as you're talking about this all makes sense to me about how you have to manage a finite amount of money with a whole lot of people asking for probably a large amount. And I just wanted to clarify with the idea of capping. I know you'd mentioned that courts will have an opportunity, or applicants rather, to give feedback or respond. So I'm just wondering, let's go back to your $1 million example. For the court that was underspent, perhaps it's because they had some vacancy savings. They had a hard time filling a position, but now they're fully staffed. That's no longer an issue. If you came to them with that cap and they said, yes, that makes sense, but here's why that won't be an issue again, could that be a consideration? And I understand not everybody can justify all of the underspending, but just, is there a little room for applicants to paint that picture for you all?
Yes, absolutely. So that would be part, and we'll have this discussion at the end, part of that, this challenge of aligning the recommendations from you all with what courts actually need. And so, yes, it would be a recommendation and a guidance of, here's where we think you land with operational costs. If there's a caveat in the budget sheet, the actual budget request, there will be space for that to explain that if they do request more funds. So absolutely. Any other comments on this? Is this oh, Jake, go ahead.
And just keeping in mind too, that some, not so much courts, but counties, if there's 14 million in our pot, they request 13 million just for that individual county. So we have to be diligent in one. Yeah, there might be some vacancies that went unfilled, but we got to look at the big picture. We got 52 courts to fund, not just 13 courts in 2 counties, so to speak. So I get the whole cost savings thing and vacancies, turnover, all that stuff, but we gotta, you get my point.
Yep, absolutely. Is this something, two things. Is this something that you all are comfortable with? And is it something that you all would like CJC staff to provide to you on the 31st? Current spending levels with a potential recommendation from you all. So we could do how much they were awarded, their current spending levels, and a potential recommendation from you all to cap a particular court. And the idea behind this is just because a court is doing well doesn't mean that they don't get any scrutiny or any analysis at all, right? We want to make sure that we are being deliberate about this feedback. So is this information that you all would find helpful? Kelsey?
I just had a quick question based on what you just said. Sorry. I know you're trying to
That's
move
okay.
forward.
No, you're fine.
The way that you said that, it made me think, would that be like you have to cap every court, or you would place caps on certain courts? So there would be discretion within this outline in terms of where that would be applied and where it wouldn't.
Yeah, that's up to you all on how you want
okay.
to do that. So you can provide a cap to everybody, or you can provide a cap or a recommendation for a cap based on the information that I give you. So that's kind of, if you want this information presented to you all, and then you all can make that decision based on score, based on all the information on the slide that you get, that is up to you. Or you can have a discussion about it being applicable to all courts. Up to you all. Jake.
Yeah, just to piggyback on what Kelsey was asking, it's not so much that we're capping courts, we're capping like urine samples. Some counties will pay $50 per urine sample, whereas some counties pay $3. So most of our caps historically have come in those areas. How much are we willing to pay per UA? Give counties to be able to recoup some costs. It wasn't just UAs, but it was other areas that we had hard caps on, but there were some that we were a little more lenient, more soft on, as opposed to just capping a county. Lake County, you can only request $60,000. It was more or less, we're going to pay $12 per UA, take it or leave it. So,
Jake, just to clarify, we are going to do the opposite of that. So this means that you actually cap their total request. And the idea behind it is we are identifying very specific gaps in resources that those courts need. And so doing a cap like it's been done in the past isn't necessarily helpful to all of the courts, right? And so an across the board cap on UAs won't necessarily address a specific court's adherence to standards. And so it will be a cap on their overall ask based on previous spending and how much their award was. That's what I'm specifically talking about. We will not be going into very specific line by line budget items.
I wish you would have clarified that sooner.
Sorry.
Because that was a frustration I heard from directors after we made the announcements at community corrections directors meetings, is they were frustrated by the numbers and the cap. So I like that.
Yeah. Any thoughts on this? Do you all want this information? Do you want to, Joe has a thumbs up, wants this information. Is this a decision that you want to make as the information is presented, or is this an overall decision that you want to make today in terms of capping across the board? Or do you want to wait? There's no wrong answer. RJ.
I feel like waiting to digest some of this information that we took on today, because at least for me, it was a lot. So I think that I'd like to marinate on this a little bit before making a decision.
Okay, and so I'll present this information at the same time, and then you all can decide later. Does that work? I see Julie kind of nodding her head. Jake's nodding. Okay. All right. So no across the board caps decided today. But we'll provide this information on the slide so you all can decide operational costs for each individual court and a potential recommendation of a cap on their total request. Okay, okay. Okay, so we only have 2 more bullet points on this slide. This is one, again, you all can decide this today. CJC staff recommends prioritizing the funding of court coordinators. This is previously what I talked about with county allocated money going to OJD. The majority of those funds are court coordinators. Court coordinators are instrumental in the operations of specialty courts. And so we recommend that funding be prioritized. And so what that would mean is that on the 31st, we would not discuss the funding of coordinators. That would kind of just be something that was prioritized and could go into the final application round when you all review budgets. This has been done in the past. It was done last time as well. And so I just kind of wanted to see what y'all thought. Joe.
So I know this has been brought up before in some of our previous reviews, but you know, sometimes if we've got programs that have like 3 people in them, you know, do we need a full-time FTE for a coordinator position? And then there's also some cost shifting, you know, that goes on when we just make blanket, we will fund coordinators at full-time, this regardless of whatever. It kind of, on a local level, it can be a challenge sometimes when you're trying to get partners on board with, you know, what they're doing and stuff like that. And it kind of takes some of that away, that discretion away from those conversations about what's needed to actually make the program work, especially if you're not getting all of the funding, you know, for some of the other requests. Like you might have a different department or agency that's been hit pretty significant, for example, and directly impacts their ability to do that work. And so, so it takes away some of the flexibility, you know, like if a local court can do 85% through a grant, 15% pickup or whatever on their end, that allows them some of these monies to go somewhere else. So I guess that's a question I would have about just locking in a absolute and then courts can just put in for whatever and get whatever. It kind of presents a challenge maybe.
Yes, let me clarify that, Joe. So it would be we would review the FTE requests. It would just not be a discussion in terms of recommendation for a court coordinator for funding on the 31st. So the FTE and the current level and all of that would be reviewed and looked at. It would just end up being, that amount would end up being, it wouldn't be discussed on the 31st, basically. So
I guess the question I'd have is, so is the staff looking at it, reviewing it and making a determination that that's adequate request of FTE, or is that the committee that does
that's
that?
up to you all. We can do that along with OJD. We could review current FTE levels and whether or not it's sufficient. If that's something, and that would be essentially prioritizing the funding of them on the 31st, or it could be something that you all could look at as well. It's up to you. This was done last time. I don't remember I don't know if you remember that, but this was the prioritization of court coordinators was done last time as well. And the same process was, is the FTE sufficient? It wouldn't be everybody, you know, coming in at a 1.0 FTE. That's not something that would be,
Okay.
Yeah.
That's why I was asking, because if it's similar to what we did last time, then it makes sense because, you know, as we get into some of the discussion, there's some things that you realize, and especially with where they're ranked, for example. And so I just want to make sure that we were just saying, like, if they put in a request right now, then it's all funded and we're good to go. And it's not part of the conversation because that's not really, I don't know how helpful and effective that is on a local level to manage the politics of it. So.
Okay. Sounds good. RJ?
I was curious as to, have you guys had a conversation before within CJC about funding this position when it applies to counties that also receive funding for like the vets treatment court. Because it makes no sense that, you know, the vets treatment court applications could apply for a full-time court administrator while they also have a full-time court administrator for the mental health and the drug courts when they're using the same person. And so I'm wondering if, and especially considering that this is a grant that does the, you know, the funds up front as opposed to the RFR, you know, how are we taking into that account?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what typically happens is if there's multiple courts, they'll have one coordinator across those courts, but it's not a full FTE per court, right? And so they break up the FTE based on what they're needed for or what hours are required across those courts. So if there's, like, for instance, there's a county that has a court coordinator that does 3 courts and their FTE is broken up depending on what they need, but it equals 1, but it's not 1 per court. Does that make sense? And so we do look at that. We make sure that it evens out and that they are being utilized in a way that makes sense for them, but also the FTE makes sense. So,
Okay, perfect.
yep. Any other thoughts on this? Okay, so it sounds like to me, this is a discussion that you all want to have with all of the information on the 31st. At least that's what I got from Joe. Everybody's nodding their head. Okay. Okay, so we will provide this information. We will have this discussion on the 31st, potentially. Okay. The other thing, and Rachel touched on this briefly with her comment and her question, is ensuring that these final budget requests based on feedback and based on recommendations from you all align. Okay. And so there's the meeting on July 19th. That is what's going to happen in that meeting, is making sure that those requests, the actual budget requests, align with your recommendations. Is there any information or specific feedback that you all want to give courts on the 31st regarding this? Or is this a discussion that we just save for the 19th of July? We also recognize that courts are going to need things that are outside of the recommendations that you give, right? And so it's thinking about having that discussion to reconcile those two things. They might need something that they absolutely cannot get anywhere else, and it's not part of your funding recommendations. And so starting to think about how to reconcile those two and what that conversation looks like. We're trying to message that courts ask for what they need and that they listen to the specific feedback that they get from you all. That's what they've been told. We're hoping that they listen. But we also recognize that there are going to be things that they need that are outside of those recommendations. And so we don't necessarily need to come to any sort of decision now, but just putting that in your all's head as we go into the 31st about how to reconcile those conversations on the 19th after we get budget requests. Any comment on that? I just wanted to kind of start that conversation. Rachel.
Another question. So the spreadsheet that folks are submitting, I just want to make sure I'm understanding this. So let's say you recommend funding 2 areas and instead the program wants to ask for funding for 3 areas, but it's maybe because one funding source that they had is expiring and so they are hoping to replace it. And so the spreadsheet itself allows for them to contextualize that ask. And it doesn't mean it's a guarantee, of course, but so they'll be able to explain kind of line item by line item, here's why we're asking for this thing that you all didn't tell us to ask for.
Yes, yeah, and that will be something that we take into account on the discussion when you all are making those final budget recommendations to the commission. So yes, so there will be room for courts to ask for what they need outside of the feedback from the grant review committee.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay, so if there's no other, oh, Joe.
I was just gonna say, I'm good with that. I have to leave to my next meeting before my next meeting. So if there's anything else, after this that you need from me or whatever, just send me an email and I can get back to you, Rachel.
Okay, thank you so much, Joe. We only have like 2 more slides left, so you're fine. So thank you
Perfect.
so much for
Thank
being
you,
here.
guys.
Appreciate it. Okay, so if there's no other comment on this, we just have a couple more things. I do want to address conflicts of interest. I have gotten a few questions about this. This is something that we kind of just keep consistent across all of our grant programs. We use this slide, which is why it's the only slide with a picture on it. And so basically what we say to this is GRC members cannot take part in any decision-making process or any recommendations on an application that will in any way benefit them. Okay, so that's kind of the overarching rule that we have. And so if there's an application that a grant review committee member submitted, contributed to, would receive funding through, or otherwise would bestow benefits upon that member. Okay, so that's kind of the list. We will ask you to identify the conflict to us prior to May 30th. So prior to the meeting, just send myself an email saying I have a conflict for this particular application. And so that we can be ready to just remind you during the meeting that you've identified that you do have a conflict. So please, if you do, please submit this beforehand. You can just send me an email. And then during the meeting, we're just going to ask that you mute yourself. You can go off camera if you'd like, but we are just going to ask that you mute yourself and you don't participate in any of the discussion. It's kind of weird. We also ask that you don't leave the meeting just because it is sometimes hard to get you back when the discussion is over. So mute yourself, get off camera, and then just don't comment. And then once the discussion is concluded, we'll just ask that you rejoin the meeting. Okay, so it's a very simple process. Just the key here is that you identify that conflict of interest before the 31st. So just get it to me on the 30th if you can. Any questions about this? Pretty straightforward. Okay. Okay, so this is a public meeting, and so this is a chance for any member of the public who is on this meeting who's not a member of the grant review committee or staff. This is your time to comment on anything that has been discussed so far. Usually we kind of keep these to 1 to 2 minutes, these comments. So if there's anybody in the public, member of the public that would like to speak, this is your time. Okay, I don't see any hands raised. Okay, any questions, concerns? I know this was a ton of information. I will be sending this presentation out to you all, so you'll have it, as well as this recording will be available for you all. And so if you would like to review this and then have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. And let's see, I don't know who was Jake. I think you were first, and then we'll go with RJ.
Just to circle back around on your conflict of interest, do we need to let you know ahead of time? Is that what you're asking, or
Yes.
prior to the start of the meeting on the 31st?
Let me know before the 30th of May. So yes, ahead of time. Just send me an email. That works.
Sounds good.
RJ.
So, back on, I want to say it was like slide 7 or something. You had talked about how the applications require courts to have a treatment provider that accepts OHP. I was wondering what happens if an individual has coverage through another insurance like the VA, or if they're requesting access to culturally responsive and culturally specific services that provider doesn't have at that moment.
Yeah, so it doesn't have to just be OHP. They just have to take OHP. They just have to accept OHP, the treatment provider. So they can use other means, but they do have to have the option of accepting OHP. that's an eligibility requirement. So it's not like all or nothing, but it is something that they do have to be willing to accept.
Okay, so the option is there for, you know, individuals in the mental health court that want, you know, culturally specific treatment provider. They have that option that they can go outside that network and work with them. To be
Yes.
in compliance of the, okay.
Yeah, yes, so it doesn't have to be across the board for participants. It can, the treatment provider that's utilized has to accept OHP. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other questions, concerns? I'll go back to my questions. Like I said, I know this was a ton of information. So if you have questions, if you think of stuff, please don't hesitate to reach out. Also, the way that we have this, the meeting on the 31st set up, based on what the feedback that you've given us, we do have 2 days. We anticipate that the second day is just a placeholder. And so the first day is going to be a long day, but based on the decisions you've made today and the recommendations that you're going to be making to the grantees, we hope to have this done in a day. I can't guarantee that because there's a lot of applicants, but we don't anticipate it taking an entire 2 days. So it's on your calendar as 2 days just as a placeholder, but we anticipate just the first day. Kelsey.
And you'd like us there in person, right?
This is actually virtual.
Just
So,
kidding.
Yep. Yeah, it's just a virtual one, so that there's no travel involved in it. Yeah. So. Any other questions? Okay, like I said, a lot of information. Thank you all so much for being here. The feedback you've given us has been incredibly helpful for our analysis moving forward. And we'll see you all on the 31st.